Hi, good morning. I'm Oliver Gao. I'm the director of Cornell Systems Engineering Program. As you probably saw me before, I have been very fortunate to conduct these systems conversations here at Cornell with our distinguished speakers that we bring to Cornell. So today, I'm really delighted to introduce to you Mr. Farhad Bilimoria. Actually, Farhad, he's been an energy professional more than 18 years.
Yeah.
He has covered electricity and also gas markets across Australia, New York, and California. Many different geographic regions and also different I think kind of disciplinary areas. One thing is that I admire him a lot is that he's currently, after all these years of industry experience, he's actually now coming back to academia to get his PhD from University of Oxford. So I think this is really amazing. I would definitely want Farhad to tell us more about how his career and how his interest evolved. So another thing is even amazing is that actually he has a bachelor's degree in the traditional electrical engineering, but in the meantime he studied law. How did he do that? So yeah, it's very interesting. And also he got his master's degree in energy systems from the University of Melbourne. So I think you are now. I think you are still probably working with Australian government or industry about market design of alternative energy systems. So all very hot and important topics for our society. So Fahad, welcome to Cornell.
Thank you very much.
We are very excited.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, very excited to have you, especially with your very unique, experience and also your interest. Please tell us more about it because all this evolution, of your career and your interests and your, I think your work. It's really showing kind of this very nice, systems approach and a path. Tell us more about yourself.
Sure. Well, thank you first of all for the opportunity to be here. It's actually lovely, and even just this time of year, sort of being in Cornell with the fall colours, it's fantastic. So, thank you for that invitation. As you've noted, my background is I guess I'd probably say it's slightly weird in some ways because I've sort of maybe looked at things in sort of different perspectives over my career. And I started out really as someone who had done sort of an engineering focused degree, as you mentioned, with the combination with law. I actually started to move first into to pick another discipline into the finance area. So actually my first role out of university was looking at engineering and infrastructure investments from a financial perspective. Australia was going through quite a landmark set of privatization of their infrastructure assets, all the way from water utilities to electricity networks and generation facilities to its road networks. And so there was actually a very big demand for people who knew a little bit about the engineering and the technical side of things to actually convey that knowledge into what makes a good investment.
Yeah, I think this reminded me. I remember that Australia has been doing quite a lot of public-private partnerships. And I think all this infrastructure, being privatized, that's probably part of underneath that kind of mechanism design.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So there was a very strong push towards bringing the private sector into investment and operation of large-scale essential infrastructure. So there was a rationale. The rationale for it was really fueled by this idea of efficiency. And both from a capital perspective, but also an operational perspective, by bringing best-of-class perspectives from industry into the delivery of essential services, hopefully the idea is that you get efficiency. And so it was quite complicated to, first of all, understand the technical attractiveness and rationale of different infrastructure assets, and then apply sort of a financial perspective on that, and what that really taught me was how investors look at investments in this sort of space, essential infrastructure, transportation, utilities, communications infrastructure. Those are really the foundation of our everyday society. And so to kind of take a capital markets lens on that was quite interesting. So that was really where I cut my teeth, providing investment advice to large-scale investors, primarily pension funds in Australia. So there was a big trend towards pension funds investing in infrastructure.
Yeah, there's a good match, because in pension funds, they are not necessarily looking for very high return, but they're looking for stable returns.
Exactly.
Yes.
So one of the interesting rationales was really that removal of volatility and particularly inflation protection, which is quite relevant in today's discussion.
Absolutely.
And so that was the rationale. And so what was attractive to investors was not necessarily having, as you said, high returns, and the potential for order of magnitude returns. It was really stable cash flows and low risk. And so that perspective was that gave me a very interesting perspective on the types of investors that invest in these types of assets. And so I did that for a number of years and found my interests really focusing in on the energy sector. So while I did a wide range of investments and transactions and looked at different sectors, I found energy to be really interesting. And one of the reasons that I found energy to be really interesting was it really brought together a number of disciplines. So, I'm an engineer at heart. And when I first came across the idea of spot pricing of electricity, that was something that actually really blew my mind. I mean, the idea that you can translate the physical constraints of an electricity network into a financial metric was something which, and again, from someone who had done engineering but had done finance, was quite mind-blowing. And so I started to do more and more of that, and then decided that I'd actually like to learn more about the operations of markets for electricity in particular. And so then after doing many years of investments, I moved to the Australian Energy Market Operator, which is the Australian independent ISO for the East Coast, at that point the East Coast of Australia, but also now runs the entire market across the West Coast and Northern Territory as well. So that gave me a really interesting insight and opportunity to learn about how markets are run, and particularly complicated markets that involve very complicated technical and engineering considerations, and again translate that into risk from a capital and financial perspective. So that was kind of what drew me, and at that point, again, by twist of fate, at the time that I joined AEMO was a time where major issues and challenges started to emerge in the Australian system. So the first week I got to AEMO, we had the big South Australian blackout, where the entire state of South Australia was disconnected from the grid for a very long time. It took weeks for certain other parts of that grid to get reconnected. And so again, it brought all these issues up, which had been quite settled under a framework of yesteryear of fossil, thermal, synchronous generation. And all of a sudden now, with the introduction of new forms of technology, it introduced new engineering challenges and then new market challenges as well. So it was a great chance to just see that and learn more about that. And then again, I think what that drove was really a want to understand the underlying basis of it. Where do we actually need to change what we have, or is the current system workable with some tweaks? And that was sort of that really drove me to understand, to go back into research, because it was something that when I'd read, again, some of those foundational papers, it just blew my mind. And after sort of working in industry for 18 years or so, it was just a great opportunity to just step back, take a different perspective on things, and sort of come back to basics a little bit in some ways, and just sort of say, okay, well, why are we doing what we're doing? It's been a very interesting experience as well, and quite challenging, very different from the commercial world. Probably one of the most challenging parts of my career to date. So it's been a very interesting ride so far.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing with us, Farhad. So you can see that I think when we were talking about it seems to me it's really like two tracks. One is really this kind of as you said, engineer at heart, right? You maintain this curiosity of this physical know-how, how this system physically is working. But kind of different for you, but different from many other traditional engineers, that you also had very deep experience in this financial market. And also the thing is that for the daily operation and even daily running of our society, actually these two things, they have to work in harmony to do that. And especially now, it seems so in the financial track and also this kind of physical track, physical systems track. And then now with all these alternative energies coming in, of course, as you said, they have all the different physical characteristics.
Yeah.
And when they are coming in to this traditional power grid system, and also in the meantime, because of society, we're facing all this climate change challenge and sustainability challenge, such that these alternative energy sources, they could play a more important role than what they were viewed before, but they have their own limit or something. So this gets you to start think whether the existing or traditional framework, which is essentially the infrastructure, I'm not calling the physical infrastructure, the whole system is infrastructure, you are now probably questioning. That's seemed to me that brought you back to Oxford.
Yes, indeed.
I think in that sense, I think you are lucky, because you can see that many engineers, right, they're trained in their traditional discipline throughout their whole career. They just work in that area. They're making, but for you, it's really because of your background, you have this out-of-box thinking, right? So now let's see. It seems like you identify some key areas you want to find out. You want to dig deeper.
Yeah.
So maybe what are some exciting or major challenges have you sensed, such that, well, I'm going to use my 4 or 5 years to go back to campus to figure it out. So what are the key challenges? Because I think at this stage of your career, I believe like your goal is impact, right? You want to use your career to, especially you're thinking about all these existing systems, so you want to have an impact. So to what challenge do you want to make contributions to have an impact?
Very, very good question. I think at a very high level, what we are going through, and will continue, I think we're just at the start of it, is a period of tremendous change. Change in the way that we deliver essential services, changes in the way we as consumers interact with those services, and combined with that sort of hard-nosed engineering change, a lot of social change that comes with that. The entire economy and socio-economy has to change and adapt to the risks, really the existential risks that we face. And so, when we think about sort of the classical models of systems organization and governance, particularly in the energy system, the traditional approach was under the guise of what's known as the energy trilemma. So the need to balance system reliability with efficiency and cost against the environmental impacts. And obviously what we're seeing with climate change and some of the biggest impacts on our society is the relative importance of those changes over time. And one of the most critical factors really over the next 10 years and the limited time frame we have is that the environmental aspect is now at a critical point. Yeah. And so naturally that receives so much of the focus of policymakers, of market participants, of governments to essentially decarbonize economies at scale in a very rapid trajectory. And so that, rather than being, if you kind of think about a constrained optimization, rather than being part of the objective function, in many senses, I would argue that becomes now a constraint. That becomes a given. You have to decarbonize the economy by a certain period. And so that, again, changes the equation of how you achieve these other goals, because they're still important as well. You can decarbonize the economy and energy systems, but you've got to make sure they're reliable as well. And as we see currently with what's going on in the world, cost and efficiency is critical as well. So the management of that change is I think, the high level focus. In terms of getting into that next level of detail, and most of my time is focused on electricity markets. Because of the shift, I think, to electricity, and you can kind of see it with the electrify everything, and you've probably seen it in transport as well. A lot of the shift is now, well, let's electrify. And so electricity being, which currently I think is at about 20% of intermediate energy sources, kind of will become potentially a much larger component of the intermediate energy transfer. And so you need to now make sure a lot more of society is depending on reliable electricity service. So you've got to make sure that system is secure and resilient. And so as you get into the detail of that, there's challenges associated and emerging with respect to making sure, really on a couple of different angles, one of which is sort of the high level of resource adequacy, making sure now you've got, rather than sort of the traditional approach where you had, dispatchable thermal resources that, you could bring in merit order and you could schedule them. You now have resources that have very low marginal costs, but are variable. So when the sun's shining, when the wind's blowing, they're fantastic, and they're very essential to the system. What happens when they're not? Making sure you've got enough firming and flexible generation to balance that out, and the role of storage as well becomes critical. So from a systems perspective, a lot of my work is focused on how do you create the right incentives, both in the market, but also from the perspective of the agency making the resource adequacy decisions around what levels of resource adequacy you need in the system. That's also important because you want the market to be incentivized, but you also want the decisions around how much, for want of a better word, capacity should be in the system, how much margin on capacity should be in the system. Those should be adaptive as well to changes in the market and changes in system conditions and our understanding of the system. So that's one big area of research. The other area that I spend a bit of time on as well is system security. And that's really where, you're trying to reconcile the physics of complex dynamical systems to a market or a regulatory framework. And I think that's the next level of challenge. And that's not a new thing. That is part and parcel of the way electricity markets, and especially the academic rationale for electricity markets, were formulated. But now you're seeing new challenges, new physical behaviors. And so you've got to think about what that means for the economics of those markets or regulation as well.
Wonderful. So you talk about, I think it's great that, where I think you talk about it, from a either from a regulator or from an energy provider, supplier perspective, right? How you allocate, the capacity and the resources. Of course, one thing when I was looking at your research, right? So, one thing, 2 points. The first point, I'm going to sidetrack us a little bit. You mentioned constraint optimization earlier, right? So because of this, we're at the critical point of all this environmental quality protection and such that you're saying like this constraint will be becoming more and more binding, right? So that we have to take these things into account. One thing I think one of the major difficulty in environmental abatement is that it has been viewed mostly either by industry or by individuals as counterproductive. You see what I mean? Because it's extra cost, it's counterproductive. So that's why the government regulated, and then for the industry, when the industry is doing the optimization, right, this regulation will enter into their decision as a constraint. But we all know about the cat and the rat. That's kind of right, kind of. So this one, my question is that do you think, especially with your experience working at the intersection between regulation and also the production side, because I suspect if the industry is always viewing this environmental mission as constraint instead of as an objective. So it's more about how can we align the environmental goals with other goals of the industry and the decision makers, such that all these environmental things, it becomes their pursuit instead of a constraint.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And so I guess when I was talking about constraints, what I meant was the imperative for decarbonization to happen. It must happen, kind of thing. But I think what you've just raised is quite interesting, because from a participant perspective, you would actually like to have the environmental objectives in the participant's objective function, right? So it would make sense. So if you can in some way align what you want from a societal perspective, which is the mitigation of emissions of hydrocarbon emissions, and so if you can find a way to align that with the participant's objective function, that's fantastic. And I think again, to get really wonky here, it's the sign on that objective function matters as well. So is that environmental objective a negative cost or a cost on that profit maximization, so that emissions, so then that's the idea between of emissions trading and pricing the emissions externality and the carbon price and that sort of stuff. Is it a penalty function, or is there a way of making it into a reward, which is the other side of the coin when you look at the way in which renewable energy credits work. So that's where you get an additional reward for investing or generating renewable energy, for example. So it's quite interesting from a behavioral perspective. The impacts of that sign matters. Is it a penalty or is it a reward? And there's probably an argument that suggests that you've got to think about both aspects. I think that alignment is really important, because I think if you mobilize industry, you can see the benefits of that alignment. But then again, I think you've got to also think about the overlay and the regulatory constraints that are sensible, in that environment as well.
I think so. Fahad, thank you. You already, I think, hinted to you direct me to a deeper thinking, and I think you are right. So it's really about how to price and value all these environmental outcomes. So far, it's kind of from economics point of view, right? Kind of when we talk about, say, for an economy, for a society, what are the production factors?
Yeah.
They theory say, okay, there is labor. Labor is an important production, capital, and then energy. But you can see so far those emissions are not counted. So the reason is that because carbon dioxide is at $10 per ton or $400 per ton.
Yep.
So I agree. I very much agree with you. It's really because if you cannot price and value it, there's no way you can manage it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is really exciting because in that sense you can see that actually all the technical or the market instruments are already out there. And the people started, even though it's been several decades, people started realizing the importance of all these environmental goods. But so far, it seems like we have not figured out a very good way to price it, to value it, and of course to monitor it.
Yeah.
Because we all know that if you cannot measure something, you cannot improve it. And as soon as we're able to measure and price and value it, and then it can get into that objective function. And the science, it really depends on, if there is market mechanism for crediting, and then that will be a positive sign. And if there is a tax, something that will be a negative.
Yeah.
Right? But the key thing seems to be really, I feel all those financial or legal instruments are there, regular instruments are already out there.
Yeah.
But just people, you can even decide what sign you can use, but you don't know how to quantify it.
I think it's a really important
discovery
point.
Of the value.
Absolutely. And I think this is where the mechanism design matters a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think, economists have, for a number of years, posited that the first best solution is essentially to put a price on carbon.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, from a political economy perspective, has been quite challenging in a number of markets. And so there's sort of been this natural progression down to then say, okay, well, from a policymaker perspective, what's the next best alternative? And so you kind of, okay, if the first best is not going to work politically, what's the next best alternative? And this is kind of where, the complexity is important to understand because it can lead to quite divergent outcomes. And I'll give you two examples of which, both of which are from an Australian context, but actually apply quite across the world and is very topical, is in the way in which the environmental externality is priced. So, for example, in many jurisdictions, they have, through creating obligations for renewable energy, a market for tradable renewable generation credits.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is where, essentially if you generate from solar or wind or some renewable source or no zero carbon source or, potentially low carbon source, you have a credit associated with that and you get a payment based on that.
Mm-hmm.
And you can trade that in the market and it's a source of revenue. And so that has essentially incentivized investment in Australia. That's incentivized the build out of renewable generation quite significantly because it is linked to the amount that you generate. So you have a degree of compatibility between the incentives of the agents in the market, which are actually wanting to do the work and build all these things, with your social objectives. The other side of the coin is, to put an example in for, and to caveat this is the way in which many abatement credits have worked. So abatement basically works on this idea that you are going to do something, and now you are not going to do it to save emissions, or you are basically stopping emissions. So, you were going to operate a power plant and you decide to knock it down because of the emissions impact. Or quite often, for example, to use an Australian example, there's land that's reserved for agricultural or farming use, to repurpose that into to forest or emissions positive land use. Now, the challenge with that is that the incentives for participants can become skewed, because your onus from a participant perspective, if I want to get that green credit, all you've got to show is that I'm not going to do something, or I was going to do something and now I'm not. So you're kind of working against a counterfactual, which is very hard to prove. Whereas with an emissions credit, with a generation credit, you just get the money for generating. Here you're getting the credit for not doing something, and that's always harder to establish. And so that's why potentially you're seeing challenges to these schemes, not only in Australia but around the world. You have these issues around greenwashing and the like, but that goes to the heart of the design of those schemes. And they're not easy to design, but that's part of that challenge, is that agents will do things that are aligned with their incentives. And if you don't recognize that in the design of that scheme, that's where problems can arise.
Beautiful. So this kind of lead me to my next question. I think you already probably hinted towards that. I'm just curious because, when I was thinking about it, if you think of this emission, these environmental things as another production factor, and I seem like you are saying that one of the key difficulty is really, one of the key thing is really mechanism design. Of course, mechanism design will be still based upon pricing and evaluation. So that kind of gets us back to market. In fact, one of the key functions of market is to discover value and give a price. So I think, for example, of course, it's mainly because we have all this established, but I don't think it's easier to price, for example, even oil or gas.
Yeah.
So is there any analogy? If we go down a path of building an analogy between how the infrastructure market support you to price oil and gas versus the existing knowledge and infrastructure to help you price emissions, what are the key differences? Because now we are very successful. We can, the system can price energy very easily.
Yeah.
And then you can even have this kind of 15 minutes trading. And it's but what is lacking in the infrastructure of emissions market that prevents as good pricing and trading like we have for energy sector?
I think I don't necessarily think that the core problems are in necessarily the mechanism design, but more the political economy of the mechanism design. What I mean, just to get maybe to sort of get a bit more, provide a bit more thought to that, is the political challenge that that's certainly not my area of expertise or by any stretch. To get a pricing or a penalty framework in place for what we deem as bad, which is emissions, seems to be subject to political challenge. So it's easy for someone to say, "Oh, you're putting a tax on industry, or you're putting a tax on the economy," and so I think that's been challenging in many markets. That's not to say that strong, politics and leadership can't get over that, but that's, I think, been the challenge. Now, in terms of the mechanism design at that next level, I think markets are quite capable of reflecting essentially the cost of abatement and the cost of emissions reductions into that price. I think where the challenges do lie, and to kind of provide that specificity, is on a couple of levels. So one is in the granularity of those prices. For example, with the purchase of emissions credits, for example, by large-scale corporates that are looking to decarbonize, it's not just the purchase of abatement, it's also or purchase of renewable energy. It's also the time at which that happens, because someone like Google, for example, is wanting to match its abatement to its load, so that it can actually claim that, but they can actually verify that they are buying clean power 24/7. So the time granularity also becomes important, and so that's kind of an evolution. The other side of the coin, which I think is kind of the gap in these markets, is the fungibility and tradability of different instruments, both within a region but across regions as well. So how does emissions reduction or emissions abatement in Australia trade off against our neighbours in New Zealand? Can I trade an emissions credit overseas? And what are the verification schemes that apply? And I think that's sort of the deep, the level of granularity that you've got to get to establish that tradability. And then one of the big issues in Australia right now is the fungibility between a renewable generation credit and an abatement credit. So there are some lines of argument that suggest that we need to establish a link between the two, so that the generation of renewable energy, for example, can be translated to relevant abatement. And so that's sort of the next phase, I think, of bringing really a holistic approach to managing both the systems and the sort of the environmental externality that's associated with it.
Great. So it's great to talk to, because I think you always kind of drive things to the very fundamental things. What I learned from you just said, it's kind of basically like two aspects. One, you mentioned political. It's not a barrier. It's political incompetency, I would say, for those challenges. But of course, you know that in a democratic kind of countries, nations, political thing is really a reflection of the public opinion, right? I think that makes perfect sense, because, right, if the public is not there, and assuming that the government reflects what the public wants, so I guess that's very fundamental, right? If the public is not if the public is not there, and then the politicians do not have enough support to go against those political barriers, right? I think that's one thing. Another thing, you talk about the time granularity, right? And also you talk about tradability of all these emission credit in Australia versus can you exchange? Can you do it like on New York Stock Exchange, something like that? So that, I think, that is indication of the lacking of not only very well established, but a very well designed infrastructure to support these things. So, but of course, if there is no political support, you cannot build that infrastructure, right? So I think that's very nice. And now I would like to switch kind of gear into some details. I think of course, I don't want to pry too much into your today's talk, but I cannot help asking you, because I think you mentioned several key, very interesting topics, especially as we integrate alternative energy sources into our existing power grid. And I think you used the word, fragility. It's both from the supply side and also the demand side. And you mentioned some new physical characteristics into this system that will actually introduce fragility or vulnerability of this system. That actually makes me curious. So in general, right? Of course, you have the financial background, right? Before, right? If we if our energy sources, we have say, these only three options, hydro, nuclear, coal-fired, just making an example, right? Basically, you only have say three stocks in your portfolio, right? And you are doing these things. And now, actually, with addition of say, solar and wind, so to me, when you diversify your portfolio, you are supposed to be more robust. Yeah. Why do you think that actually it makes the system more fragile?
It's a really good point, and I think the way to characterize fragility and resilience in the system is really by looking at or trying to understand the impact of different the interactions between different types of resources in the system. And you're right. I think from a diversification perspective, as we think about capital markets theory and the like, yes, having 10 non-correlated stocks in your portfolio is better than having just one. Mm-hmm. And I think the same applies in energy systems. To have a diversified portfolio of different types of generation, which are resilient and exposed, which are resilient in one aspect and then exposed to different types of risks is important, because if you would get, for example, an extreme weather event, like an extreme heat event, for example, mm-hmm. you don't want all of your generators exposed in the same way, because then all of your, lack of correlation becomes, crisis correlation. So understanding the fragility of different types of systems is really important. And I think one of the benefits of that is that diversity and having different types of risk exposures that renewables are exposed to, synchronous generation is exposed to, etc. Where the fragility, I think, is starting to be exposed is really on that next layer down in terms of the engineering. So kind of trying to pry open a little bit of the abstraction that we have in electricity markets, for example. We make assumptions. The beauty of the original electricity pricing, the ideas and the theory of electricity spot pricing was reliant on some important assumptions that allowed us to translate, complex three-phase dynamical systems into a single phase and ultimately a commodity which can be traded in time and location. And so with new types of systems interfacing, so for example, renewables interface with the grid in a fundamentally different manner than synchronous generation, you now have to figure out how to adapt the behavior of those systems to, again, allow us to make the right assumptions. So arguably today, by having different interactions or interfaces with the grid, the assumptions that we made in the past around the delivery of certain essential services like inertia and system strength, we can't necessarily make those assumptions again today, at least from the way in which we have been doing or regulating the access of new resources. And so what we have to think about is either how we get these services from someone else or some other resource, or how we adapt the control of those new resources to better serve the needs of reliability and security in the system. So I think it's kind of a bit of both. And I think the challenge right now is really translating this sort of complex engineering of dynamical systems into something that can be potentially commoditized, or if not, recognizing that that's not possible and we need to put in something else that allows us to still ensure reliability of the system. Because ultimately, having a decarbonized electricity system is great, but the lights need to stay on for us to be able to use that electricity. Mm-hmm. So I think really just getting into that next layer of understanding, I think, is important, and that's also where the complexity lies. I think it's very tempting to kind of continue to make the core assumptions. And I think in many aspects we can make those core assumptions, but not for all time and place. And so that's, I think, where that complexity is and where the challenges are of the next few years.
Absolutely, and I think Farhan, when you answered, at the beginning you mentioned, that in the financial market and analogy, but you did mention one key word. It's kind of, yes, you can expand your portfolio, and that in general will increase, the reliability or the performance. However, the key thing is that when you expand your portfolio, make sure that your portfolio consists of uncorrelated assets. I think that is really the key, because and actually that got me thinking. Somehow I feel, if you think about this energy system, right? So actually adding solar, wind, or even geothermal, all these things to the portfolio, which is really a good thing. And theoretically and empirically, they should improve, the performance, actually the robustness and the resilience of our power system. But the key thing why I think, and you're right, your claim is right. The key thing that this expanded portfolio-based system could become more fragile, it's because I think two things. One is, of course, you mentioned complexity. All right. If you just think about, and just give you an example, right? When you had your wife, before you had children, life, and we have children, right? It's really complexity, the dimension, right? But the good thing is that complexity can make things better, and it could make things worse. The key thing is that how can we, make complexity towards our advantage? The thing is that I think somehow going back to some kind of optimization in for all the systems, like when you say, we have all these new energy sources, and I want to integrate these new energy sources into my power grid, I feel it really gets back to, again, the objective function, right? So if a decision maker focuses on integrating all these new options, new sources into the existing system to maximize his or her, the organization's profit. So we know that optimal systems, they're usually, yes, they could be the best, but they are actually the most fragile, because optimal systems are usually not robust. Right, so that can get me to a question of, when we have all these new energy sources coming to you, especially you either at the government level or operators level or transmitters level, when you have these new options, new sources come to you, yes, you want to optimize. But my question is, to what extent should we optimize such that you reach the sweet spot where the complexity helps you instead of bites you?
I think you raise really a very important point about systems resilience. And actually, one of the professors here at Cornell, Jacob Mays, has written some really good pieces on that. And while markets are great, and getting the wisdom of the expertise and innovation of multiple participants and harnessing that is fantastic. The practicalities of gaps in market instruments are not something to assume away. I think that and recent events, and quite often most of that happens, that can happen at the extremes, and we tend to sort of we can potentially exclude that from our analysis, but again, you're excluding a very important part, the tail of the curve, the probability curve distribution. And so when you talk about things like correlation, and we can analyze correlation over days like these and get some ideas of patterns, and that's fine. But that's only one aspect of correlation. and you look at the work that people like Carolyn Kuski and Roger Cook have done in the insurance space, what they talk about is things like, they talk about in the climate space, they talk about tail dependence and crisis correlation. So it's great that, on days like these, things are uncorrelated and we can get balance. What happens when things really go bad? Is everything, what's the resilience of those systems during extreme events? And I think that's also an important part of the analysis. And that's quite often where the gaps in market frameworks can emerge. One of the challenges that was brought out really by the latest energy crisis in Australia, where we actually had a recent suspension of the market, was the challenges associated, and the crisis was not that we had a crisis, a scarcity of power, we had scarcity of energy. And so the challenges that emerged in terms of how we run the dispatch, particularly under these extreme and capped conditions, that what the crisis or what that event did provide in terms of learnings was that's also where some of the gaps in existing market frameworks are, and we have to think about. It's important, that when we design that system, that we're also spending lots of time designing what happens in these sorts of contingencies. And another example in ERCOT recently. So that it's really when you talk to folks in the planning department, for example, at operators, and then you talk to folks in the control room, you get very different and interesting perspectives. When you talk to folks in the control room during these times, it's all about responsiveness and creating tools for dynamic intervention and dynamic assessment of risks in the market. So when something is happening, it's kind of like a DEFCON situation. There are folks that are trained to analyze conditions and make real-time decisions, and so you want to have the tool set and the flexibility for those personnel to make those decisions. On the other side of things, a system planner will always say, well, yes, that's right, but we also want to think about things that might happen over a longer term time frame. And if we don't make decisions now and make the right investments today, things will be a lot worse when you get those extreme conditions. And so there's two different perspectives, but both are very important. But you have to take those into account when you're designing systems for the extremes as well.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful point. It's really, I think it gets to the a higher level. It's really how do we deal with independence and interdependence? How to balance these two things, right? So I think this is really wonderful. I know, like in our time is probably coming up, education, right? So kind of, I realized, you and I, we sit together. The topic you talk about, all the way from power grid operations, right, to stock market, to financial, to operations of energy market, and all these things you have benefited from. I believe from your comprehensive knowledge structure, thanks to your experience and your academic training. So. And also, I feel that, as I mentioned earlier, I feel our world needs more people like you who can view these issues from all these different areas. How can universities and set up our curriculum and set our education system to produce more? Or actually, what I produce is not really the best word, but I say empower more talents like you have. Any suggestion for Cornell System Engineering program in our education, both our philosophy as well as our kind of day-to-day operations?
And thank you for that. That's a very good question, and I think education is core. It's central. I think the initiatives that you've got in terms of even just having a systems engineering department and a focus and now research in that area is pretty innovative and quite exciting, because you need, you might have, people will have different interests in terms of, areas and sectors that they might want to focus on. But the high level considerations of systems, there is consistency among that. And so, encouraging that, and even researchers who are in departments to kind of then try to take a bit of a higher level perspective and interact with different disciplines, I think is really important. The other thing which I think is relevant is bringing participants from different or bringing the student cohort that have different perspectives. So having folks that are in research and theory combined with folks that may have practical experience is really important, and potentially at different stages of careers as well. I mean, I think I'm actually pretty lucky to have the chance to go and do a PhD. I mean, many of my peers would probably jump at that chance as well. But I think where I look at the strengths that I can bring, I can bring some industry expertise and some knowledge of kind of what happens in the real world. Where I get the chance to learn is, how to actually take that and actually use it to convey some interesting insights and use, the state-of-the-art techniques
and get it to the next level.
And bring it to that next level. So I think it's really important. And I think what I like about programs, that have a systems focus is you could potentially bring people from different parts of the industry and different parts of their career that might want to go back into research. And I think that's where, I had to sort of try and push through a few different venues to kind of, have the opportunity to do that. And it is, as you said, constraining when you have the realities of family life and things like that. So that's, that's the reality as well, though. So I think just having that thought process of, how can we best make the facilities available for, I'm probably speaking too generally here, but maybe encouraging, later career people as well to kind of be interested in research. I think there's, at least from my discussions, there's probably a whole host of people that would be interested in doing research, even if it's not full-time, maybe part-time, or maybe as a collaborator. But so getting those participants in would be really, really good as well.
Actually, you brought up such an important point. The thing is that here, Cornell System Engineering Program, we, due to the structure, and also I think the program has been pushing the boundaries in the traditional education. Actually, we have a distance learning component for our professional degree. But you mentioned this kind of, for example, the PhD level. Actually, there have been quite a few people in industry, and they're really interested in pursuing a PhD. But I think we've been working with the graduate school, but we have not got there yet. But I think the conversation today, especially your point, kind of reminding me of that. I think that there is a very unique value proposition. And also another thing is really that people from industry, when they decide to get a PhD, one, they already know why they want to do that. It's not like I kind of straightforward from undergrad, grad, and they just did it. But I think people, after they have the working experience, they come to a program with problems they want to solve, and with a vision that is generally not available kind of for the fresh out undergrad student. I think there is such a benefit. Thank you for bringing that up, and I'll definitely keep this in mind. And but to make those things happen, we'll need to keep pushing the boundaries, because post-pandemic, a lot of things are happening in the higher education system, and I think it promotes the higher education system to start thinking, what exactly is the value that universities deliver to the students and contribute to the society. And in the end, it's really about impact, right? I think thank you for bringing that up. I think we should be all set.
Excellent.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the invitation. Lovely to be here.